Essentially, I'm attempting to improvise in the style of the classical composers by using a sort of framework of their music. In particular, I was looking at this sonata of Mozart. As you can see, I've roughly analyzed it. This is the kind of work that most music students will do in their basic harmony classes. Most undergrads are required to analyze in this style. I didn't go overboard and analyze every note. I just kind of got a rough estimate of what's going on. And the unfortunate part of these analysis classes is I was never required to create anything mimicking the style of these compositions. Now, contrast that to the jazz classes that I took on improvisation, and it couldn't be more different. So typically in the improv classes, we would begin the class by listening to excerpts of certain pieces, and we would be required to write down as many points as we could about what we heard, and then we would go over these pieces. We'd kind of be in a circle, we'd continue playing through, and we would just take turns soloing. We would go through this for like an hour. And what it did is it caused us to sort of internalize these scales, these chord structures. And as I look at pieces like Mozart, one of the composers who did improvise very frequently, you find that a lot of the same structures are present. Take, for example, this sonata K309, also by Mozart, and you'll find a lot of the same chord structures and the same harmonic patterns. Anyone familiar with the sonata allegro form knows that there's a particular way of writing it: the A theme, the B theme, the transition, the development section, the recapitulation. And so for composers and musicians of the time, it was not too hard to improvise in this style because they would be very familiar with these patterns. In a particular sense, the harmonies are actually quite simple. They tend to be diatonic, meaning that they don't stray too far away from the tonal center. Take, for instance, famous right? You have one chord, 5/7, 1, 4, 1. Any pop song of today would use those kinds of same chord structures. What is different is the way that they use the chords. So things like Alberti bass, and these scale passages in sequence. Appoggiaturas are another thing that is very common, where you'll have something like So rather than, they'll go from the minor up to the major chord, or just as a passing tone, they'll throw in that little chromaticism. Now, because I was never encouraged to write in this style, to play in this style, and never to perform in this style, when I try to do it to this day, I have certain difficulties that I come up against, in the sense that I'm always trying to insert chords, harmonies, or patterns that were not local to the style of the classical period. So for instance, I'll throw in some chord that sounds vaguely jazzy and out of place. I'm trying to practice this more so that that doesn't happen. But I guess that's what I mean when I say that it's hard to fully internalize these concepts of structure and chords without actually doing something yourself. So what I tried to do at the beginning of my little improvisation that I came up with was more or less follow the format of these chords. You'll see you have a 1 chord for 2.5 measures, 2, 5, 1. Which coincidentally is the same chord structure that jazz majors will practice constantly. At its most basic function, the 2-5-1 is sort of a pillar of jazz music. So you can practice that limitless different ways. But the same things appear in classical music, and I would argue that it's a good thing to practice these, what jazzers would call licks. So there it is. And some of them don't sound right, but I just kind of would keep messing around with these chords until they started to sound more classical. So trying to keep the Alberti bass, trying not to add something like that. That type of chord has a 9 in it, which is very rarely found in classical music. So trying to stick to the basics with trills. Not so good. Yeah, but you see what I'm doing. I'm just kind of experimenting with different things. Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach was the son of Johann Sebastian, and he wrote a treatise on the art of keyboard playing. It's still very well respected by musicologists to this day, and I've read several portions of it for my classes. One of the sections, he was talking about how in order to be a good full-fledged musician, one must know how to modulate from one key into any other key at any time. Something that jazzers do, yet again, classical musicians have neglected this. So through the use of secondary dominants, you should be able to wind up from any key into any other key. Now the way this plays out in classical music, oftentimes you'll move from the tonic to the dominant. So tonic, I'm in D, and you'll want to move to A. And the way you'll do that is you'll take the dominant of A, which is E7. So somehow you need to get from here to there. So we can see what Mozart does. Another very classical thing is he tends to stay on one chords for a very long time, much longer than we would in more contemporary music. But here's your pivot chord right there. So he goes from a 2 chord, makes it a 5 of 5, and then oscillates between the 5-1, 5-1 until he arrives at A major. So simplifying this down, you have something. So you move from a 2 chord, you add that G sharp, which creates the leading tone into here, but you don't want to give it away so easily, so you'll go back and forth between these two. And then you start your new theme, whatever it might be. So basically what I've done is I've created a project for myself where I practice improvisation in the style of other composers, just to understand how they wrote their music, the signature marks of their music, the chords, the harmonies, the scale passages. And in doing so, I find out a little bit more about my own playing. For instance, I played in churches for many years. I played gospel music. I played in jazz settings. And what? You want to play some Mozart? And I think it's a shame that I'm able to improvise better in other styles than the style that I actually studied, simply because I didn't create it. I recently discovered a very valuable resource, in my opinion, that I had never heard about, but I learned about it in studying for my dissertation on improvisation. There was this resource that composers used in the Baroque through the classical era called partimenti, which is based on basso continuo, and it's a system that's designed to teach students how to improvise. There's a fantastic online resource where you can find dozens and dozens of parts of Menti Figures. I'll leave a link in the description, but this particular one by Francesco Durante is very, very clearly made for teaching. It starts off simply with the scales, major scale, minor scale, and then they progressively get a little more complex until by the end you have ones that could be described as full-fledged pieces. You could very easily play something like this in concert. It also would teach you things like reading in alto clef, and sometimes they'll also be reading in tenor clef. So as a crash course in basso continuo, the 5-3 indicates that you're going to have a note a fifth and a third above the roots. 6-4-3, the third, a fourth, and a sixth, etc. So this is in its most simple format the way that you could play this. But it's good to play around with different possibilities. So just because it's written as this chord, you can space it out, or what in jazz is referred to as voicing, the way that you voice the chord. So it's already kind of becoming a little bit more musical. Now this next one is based on seventh chords. And a cool thing about this is that as you're studying these old parts of Menti Figures, you can realize that a lot of these same chord structures are used in newer pieces. Nope, down. I think there's actually a little bit of confusion as to what improvisation actually is. So in its raw form, improvisation means music that is written on the spot that is non-premeditated. But it's usually not completely free improvisation. Take, for instance, again, in the jazz setting, these jazzers are playing popular songs with lead sheets and chord structures that they already know. However, it's treated more like an outline. So you know the outline, and then you extemporaneously add in the margins. As if you were speaking at an event and you had your outline, you would say things connecting these various ideas. And the classical era, I think, is no different. So, for example, the cadenzas, even the ones that are written down, often will take themes from before, and they'll just tweak them a little bit. And so in practicing for improvisation, it's not really that hard. You just need to have a set of harmonic ideas, maybe a very simple motif, and you can go from there. Sometimes these can be harmonically driven, or they can be melodically driven. So with partimenti, it's driven by the harmonies, and then you find melodies to put inside. You could do an inverse process. So I'm just going to come up with a melody. I'll say F major, right? And if I wanted to make it more classical, I think there might be an opposing viewpoint here regarding classical compositions when you're talking about people like Haydn, Mozart, and Beethoven who wrote such incredible music. The question might be, there are already these amazing pieces of music written in this style. Why would we feel any need to create anything which would probably be subpar to what was already created by them? Again, I'd have to take the jazz analogy, because at this point, jazz is becoming like a classical music art form, in the sense that they're playing music from 100 years ago, but they're constantly redoing it. So I think there's a time and place for taking these works and improvising over them as kind of a tribute to the style that we love so much. I've never done this before in concert. I've never ever improvised in this style, again, because I was never encouraged to, probably discouraged from doing so. But it would be a goal of mine, and I'm hoping to one day be able to practice improvising in this style so well that I can actually come up with a sonata, just by practicing little snippets and sections. So anyways, I hope you guys find this helpful. I am not claiming to be an expert on this stuff. I'm just kind of fascinated by it. I'm on a journey and I'm learning more about classical improvisation myself. I'm going to have more content coming up, more vlogs. There's one coming up which talks a little bit about the brain science. They've done studies on cognitive function, how improvisation affects it versus memorized music. So please stay tuned for that. Yeah, as always, leave a comment below. Let me know what you think, and I'll catch you guys next time.